Hey, this is Mr. Mitchell. Today we're going to talk about gymnosperms and angiosperms, different kinds of plants. Let's talk first about gymnosperms. Gymnosperms are seeded plants that produce naked seeds. Don't worry, this still is a G-rated video. A naked seed just means that it has no fruit around the seed. So apple trees, pear trees, all that stuff, they're not going to be gymnosperms. Gymnosperms have no fruit, but they still have seeds. And you can see an example of gymnosperm here. Pine tree. It has the pine cones, and in fact that's often how gymnosperms get the reproduction of new trees. Often you have needle like leaves, and it could be scale like leaves. Don't know why I put seed here, but it's needle like leaves or scale like leaves. And you've seen some trees that kind of look like you could peel off like a scale. Those are gymnosperms there. Now scientists seem to find a lot of gymnosperms in fossils, and they are wondering if there may have been more gymnosperms in ancient times than there are now, because if you were to take a look at all the trees now around here, for example, you'll have some that have pine cones and some that have needles or scales, but most of them do not. Most of them are like elm and maple and things such as that. But scientists are suspecting that might not have been the case in ancient times, that it was heavily gymnosperm. But anyway, you may have heard of conifer tree. I believe we have talked a little bit about conifers. Those are some examples. Most do in fact produce cones, and you actually have male pine cones and female pine cones, or whatever cones they produce. And usually they're on the same tree or plant, which is kind of interesting. Yes, they often have deep roots, as you can see right here. And pollen from the male is meant to be trapped by the female ovule. So we're going to get into a little bit more about that, but here is a male pine cone and here is a female pine cone. You can see the remarkable difference there in size, and one reason it's going to be a remarkable difference is that the male pine cone or cone falls off the tree around the time it sheds its pollen. You can kind of see a little yellowish tint right here. The wind is going to pick up, and the right maturation or right maturity, the pollen is going to go off of it. And it may end up on the female on this tree, but most likely it will end up on female pine cones on another tree. And then they're going to fall off. Now, how long does it take for the pollen to fertilize the new seed in here? It could actually take up to 2 years. So that's why most of what you see is going to be this female pine cone, and that's what they look like, because they're just going to be on the tree a lot longer. The seeds mature eventually on the pine cone, and the scales open. Then the wind carries away the seeds. So these will eventually open up, and the seed will then fly out whenever it is the case. Now, those are gymnosperms. Now remember, gymnosperms have needles, cones, sometimes scale-like leaves, and they do not bear fruit. So you can imagine that one of the criteria of angiosperm is that they bear fruit, and it is. They also, not only do they have fruit, but they also bear flowers. Angiosperms, flowering plants, you can see down here at the bottom. The seeds in angiosperms are in the fruit. Now, flowers, instead of cones, are the reproductive part of this plant. It's not going to have the cones, so you don't have to, that's not where the pollen and the ovaries are. You do have both male and female in the same flower. The stamens, which is right up here, is the male, which has the pollen, and the pistil is the female, which has the ovaries here. So what's going to happen is the wind will blow the pollen out, maybe an animal will take the pollen, and you'll probably get pollen from another animal that comes here, and the actual fertilization will be in the ovary here, that's down at the bottom part of the pistil. Pistil is the female part. Now, just a couple other parts here, you know what a petal is. Sepal here is this little leaf here. You can imagine when the flower had not bloomed that these leaves were covering it up. And that's kind of the purpose of the sepal here. There's not as much purpose of it here, but it was covering it up at one point. Kind of a little bit of protection, you might say. Now, a flower's color and its smell are meant to attract insects and animals. In fact, your book is going to talk about a flower which has a smell of rotten meat. The rotten meat smell is appealing to some of the animals there, where that is. So that's why it is. Their whole purpose is the reproduction of that plant. So it has to attract these animals to get the animals to getting near the pollen. You may remember bees will get near the pollen. You've seen pictures of bees with just all kinds of pollen all over it, and then it'll fly to another one and carrying the pollen with it. So that's part of how these have to reproduce. Checking my notes here. Their presence, that's the animals. The animals' presence mean that the stamen's pollen will spread to other areas. The fruit is produced, and it's actually going to be produced out of this ovary area here. Now, if you notice, this kind of looks like the inside of an apple or the inside of a fruit. Now, this flower here probably is not going to produce an apple or a kind of fruit that we're familiar with, but that's where it comes from the ovary area. Animals can also take and eat the fruit that will eventually produce from the seed, and the seeds in that fruit will be passed through them or will be taken on their bodies to another place, more likely passed through them. Now, we do have a couple of terms down here. Yeah, I think I've covered all of these here. Monocots and dicots. A monocot is like this. And a monocot literally is an angiosperm with one seed leaf. That's where you can get mono from. Look at this leaf. It's just one long little leaf right here. One long leaf. And you've seen plants that are like this. As opposed to something like this, which has kind of a spread out leaf. And you can actually have leaves which kind of have like a clover type look to it, you might say, which could end up being part of a dicot, which is an angiosperm with two seed leaves. Now the flowers, okay, we have flowers right here, and I don't know why I didn't put it here, but the flowers typically have in a monocot three leaves in the flowers of monocots, and 4 or 5 in the dicot. So you can tell by the leaves, and you can tell by the shape of the leaves, you can tell by the number of flowers, number of leaves on the flower. Now let's go to some crazy plant facts, which happen to be in the book, which while we're doing these. A plant's response to stimulus is called tropism, and there are lots of different tropism. The stimulus could be the sun. You know how plants often lean toward the sun. The stimulus could be darkness, could be heat, but that's what tropism is, a plant's response to a stimulus. One of the plant's response to a stimulus is called thigmotropism. You don't have to know that one, but thigmotropism is when a plant curls around what it touches. I'm sure you've seen plants that are like this. This stick happened to be there, and this plant just tends to curl around. That's called thigmotropism. Now there's a plant hormone called auxin. Auxin promotes growth on the shady side of a plant stem. Now look at this. Here we have the sun that is shining on this side over here. So the auxin is actually on the other side, realizes that the other side is getting the sun, so what it does, it grows. It is like a hormone or an enzyme that promotes the growth on the other side. So what happens when this side goes up, that makes the flower or plant lean toward the sun. Isn't that something? That you can have a hormone inside a plant that realizes when the other side of the plant is getting all the sun. And that helps the whole plant and the flower itself when it faces the sun. The amount of darkness actually determines when some plants bloom. There are short day plants that bloom when the nights are longer and you have shorter days. There are long day plants that bloom when the nights are shorter, and it's because of the amount of time in the night. Over winter, many plants go into a state of dormancy. I want to talk just a little bit about this process. During dormancy, they're not going to need as much water. Cooler weather is going to stop them from making chlorophyll, and that's about the time you see them looking like this. When you have the red and the orange and the yellow show up in the fall, that's when the chlorophyll has been stopped. So it's not going to be too long after that whenever the sugar and the water is going to be transported out of the leaves and back into the trunk and in the limbs. So whenever it has the sugar and the water and the chlorophyll out of it, the leaves will fall, and you can see that's already started to happen down here. Now, we do have some more terms for some angiosperms. There are like annuals, which is like a 1 year type plant or flower, which means in the course of 1 year, from spring to fall, it begins, it becomes a mature plant, and it dies. There are biennials, which means the process takes 2 years. Now the first year you don't have any flowers or any seeds with the flowers or fruits, but it's the second year whenever you start seeing that. So it takes 2 years for the process. So on the angiosperms we have wheat, cucumbers, and marigolds, which are annuals. And also of the angiosperms, the biennials are going to be parsley and celery. But you do have a lot of perennials. Perennials are over a 2 year period. They produce a flower every year. Most of these have trunks or woody stems, and you'll be talking primarily about types of trees there. Hey, I hope you've learned a little bit about gymnosperms and angiosperms.